Now we know how we can use routing with the composition API. What about Vuex? How can we use that with the composition API? For this, attached you find another very simple dummy project. We got a counter there and a button, which currently does nothing. But this is built with the composition API. I mean, these are very simple components, but I plan on using the composition API there. The app.vue file is pretty straightforward and simple, just a couple of local components here. And then in the counter, I output the counter, but I plan on getting the counter with the composition API. At the moment, I just have a dummy counter here, which does never change. And in the control center, I also plan on defining this function with the composition API, but at the moment it does nothing. Now, obviously, we don't need Vuex for this simple of an application. We don't need Vuex for this demo, but I want to show you how you can utilize Vuex with the composition API in case you're building more complex projects where you need Vuex. So, how does this work? In main.js, I already set up a store with create store, as you learned it in the Vuex module. I have a state, mutations, an action, and a getter. And how can we now utilize that store, which I'm already using in my app, in these components? Well, just as the router, the Vue router, offered us a custom composition function, which we could call inside of our setup method to use routing features, just as the router did this, the Vuex package has something similar in store. So in the control center, where I in the end want to dispatch the increment action, I can import something from Vuex. And that something is the use store hook or the use store composable, the use store custom composition function, which is meant to be executed inside of the setup method. Here we can then call use store, and what we get as a result is access to the Vuex store, which we have attached to this application. So the Vuex store we are using with use here on our app. We get access to that store by calling use store inside of setup. Well, and once we got access, it'll of course be simple. We can just use store dispatch and then dispatch the action. So dispatch any action, like in this case the increment action, which we registered on this store. And you can then use any Vuex feature you learn about. Modules, namespacing, all of that is available. And you just use store to get access to the store instead of using this $sign store, which you would use if you would be working with the options API. Well, and therefore it's the same here in the counter where I want to get access to some data stored in the store. I can simply import use store from Vuex, then get access to the store by calling use store, and thereafter, when we want to get a counter that depends on a getter in the store, we just need to create a computed variable, a computed value, just as we do it in the options API world. So therefore we import computed from Vue, and then counter should be a computed value by calling computed, where we provide a function that will be executed whenever one of its dependencies changed. And here in this function, we return store.getters.counter, because counter is the getter name I defined here. And whenever the counter changes, Vue will detect this in the end and recalculate this computed value, which we then expose to the template. And since you learned that computed values are refs, whenever the counter does change, Vue will notice this and it will update the template in the place where we use the counter. With that, we can save that. And now if I reload, you see this works. And that's how easy it is to use Vuex with the composition API.